t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. T'es ma préférée, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello there and welcome to Bruxelles Je t'aime, Euronews' weekly talk show about European politics. On Brussels, my love, we zoom in on some stories making news across the continent and hear what's at stake for you and for Europe. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thanks for joining us. Coming up this week, all eyes on Spain. Last weekend's election outcome raises more questions than answers and shows yet another Spanish general election with a fragmented outcome. As Spaniards wait with bated breath to see who can chat up who to form a government, Brussels watches on. The big talking point here, that the far-right Eurosceptic Vox party did not do as well as the polls had predicted. We break it down. And from Sicily to Corfu, the south of Europe is on fire. With temperatures higher than ever, storms never seen before and wildfires raging, flights and package holidays have been cancelled and some holidaymakers are ending up in hospital with heat stroke. We ask if it's getting too hot to holiday and what impact this is having on the tourism sector that relies so heavily on us to spend our money. Our guests this week, Beatrix Rios, journalist for The Washington Post. Welcome.
Thank you.
Garvin Walsh, political strategist with the European Policy Centre.
Thank you.
Good to see you. And Sandra Pasadic from the Wilfred Martin Centre.
Thank you for having me.
Good to see you all. Before we hear your take on the Spanish elections, let's just remind our viewers how they went, shall we? Ellie Liberté has more.
The recent snap Spanish election on the 23rd led to an uncertain outcome. Although the People's Party Alberto Núñez Feijóo won, the right-wing bloc does not have enough seats for an absolute majority. Vox lost influence in the country, giving a break to Europe's far-right trend. On the other hand, incumbent Pedro Sanchez from the Socialists could build this majority, but it hinges on the requirements of the independentist parties. This could lead to a blockage when trying to form a new government. It could even lead to another election. All of this while Spain is holding the presidency of the Council of the European Union. So, what could this mean for Spain and for Europe?
Ellie Liberté reporting for us there. So the People's Party, PP, won with 136, followed by the Socialists, known as PSOE. They picked up 122 seats. And then the far-right Vox got 33 seats. And the far-left Sumar picked up 31. But of course, the magic number is 176. That's what they need to reach an absolute majority. So, Beatrix, I'd like to hear from you first. You were on the ground last weekend reporting on those elections and a pretty messy outcome. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, I think it's what you said before. So I think we have a very fragmented parliament, which is the result of a very polarized society as a result of the debate that we have been seeing over the past few months. And indeed, there is no clear majority on either side. Even though the Popular Party won the election, they're not going to be able to form a government. That's the most likely scenario. And on the left, we see a potential formation of a government, but very weak because they would be relying on pro-independence political parties, both in the Basque Country and Catalonia, and that would create a very unstable scenario moving forward. So what we see is indeed a very fragmented parliament, very unlikely to form a government in the next few months, and probably coming next election in the next few months.
And the Popular Party are in shock. They're devastated because they thought they had a clear victory. That's what the polls had predicted. Sandra, what has the view been here from Brussels?
Well, first of all, putting elections so soon after the regional election that took place in May, end of May, putting the general elections for 23rd of July came as a shock, I think, to everybody. So everybody had to prepare a really quick campaign for those snap elections, so to say, during also the presidency, Spanish presidency of the Council of the European Union, which also comes at a very crucial point with all the geopolitical challenges Europe and hence Spain is facing. At Partido Popular, one thing is for sure that there is a winner, even though, as Beatriz already mentioned, the key of the government is not at the winner's hand, which is Alberto Núñez Feijóo. But the loser is also very clear, also from Partido Popular, and this is Spain and the Spanish people, because the government that at the moment there might be formed, we'll see this from the 17th of August, this government is going to be very unstable. And at the moment, the three words that can describe situation in Spain is uncertainty, it's instability, and also blackmail. This is what you can see from minority parties towards the PSOE at the moment.
Gavin Walsh, let's hear from you. I mean, do you think the problem perhaps could have been that the Popular Party, or the People's Party, excuse me, that they were making alliances with Vox in the regional elections?
I mean, it's very difficult to run a negative campaign from opposition. And I think this shows that the PP failed because they had a very negative campaign. They had no vision for Spain's future. And as a result, they couldn't mobilize people. The PSOE were able to mobilize people based on fear of Vox. Vox didn't help things by going to even further to the right in the last few months, by talking about banning abortion, by talking about banning pro-independence parties. And the PP really needs to ask itself, can it tolerate being in coalition with people who would destroy the fundamental constitutional piece of Spain, which is exactly what the people like Bildu that the PSOE is in coalition with also want to do. So we have this bizarre situation where Spaniards really want, practical centrist government. The two main parties don't actually disagree on very much, but they're being pulled by the gravity of their extremist coalition partners towards something that nobody actually wants.
And as you say, there could be another election in December, in January. But it's interesting, there have been reactions here. It's interesting actually what you said about them not having a vision for the future, because of course here in Brussels many people have been looking on. We saw members of the European Parliament taking to Twitter to express how they feel, like Manfred Weber. He's of course the head of the European People's Party. He posted a photograph there with Alberto Núñez Feijóo, congratulating him of course on his victory, saying, "You have our full support." But the question is, support for what, Beatriz?
Well, that's a question right now. Indeed, Feijóo is a winner of the election, but the truth is that Spain has a parliamentary system. So it's not necessarily a presidential system where the winner who wins is necessarily going to be the one forming government, but the one who actually can build a majority. And the truth is that it's very unlikely that the Popular Party can do that, because the only political party they can rely on really is Vox, and with them they don't have a majority. And then there are a number of small political parties with a couple of seats that so far have been a little bit unclear about what their positions is going to be. But even though they would support Popular Party, they wouldn't be able to form a majority with them. So that's one thing. I believe that actually the reason why Sanchez called the election so soon after the regional election is because he was stopping the conversation being about the Popular Party winning that election and more about the coalitions that they were forming with the far right. And I think he was really smart in doing that, because the results prove that a lot of people decided to vote for the socialists, and they even got more seats. So I think that's an interesting dynamic that we see there. So now the question is whether the Popular Party is going to be able to find a majority with other political parties, which I think it's unlikely, whether they are going to go for what it seems to be now the conversation about a potential grand coalition, which I think is very unlikely, because indeed the positions of both political parties are very far away from each other, or whether we are going to see really the socialists trying to form a government. But as I said, it would be very unlikely to last because it would be very weak.
Well, it'll be a very busy summer, I believe, for all those trying to cobble up that coalition. But just want to come back to you, because your think tank, of course, it's affiliated with the European People's Party. Manfred Weber is, of course, the head of it. He looks very smiley in that photograph that we just showed there, standing beside Feijóo. But in reality, is his gamble perhaps losing? Like he's losing his gamble to try and get closer to the far right. How does this make him look on the world stage? Because he also thought the Popular Party would do very well in those elections, even better.
Well, if you look at the general result, it's also not only about that now PSOE might or might not form the new government, but it's also about that Partido Popular gained far more seats when comparing to the 2019 elections. And at the same time, it also won majority in the Senate, meaning that the blackmail that at the moment are doing the independent and nationalist parties from the Basque country and also from the Catalan. You have two parties. One on the one side is Esquerra, and on the other side it's Junts per Catalunya, which is actually the Carles Puigdemont party, and they have claims. They are blackmailing at the moment Sanchez, and this is something that it also has to go to a constitution.
And it's just worth, Sandra, pointing out to our viewers as well that the PP picked up a lot of the votes from Ciudadanos, who were just wiped off.
Indeed, that's a very interesting point, because when we talk about the result of the election, we need to take into consideration that Ciudadanos, which is a liberal party, didn't run in these elections. So a lot of the voters, they either went for the Popular Party and the Socialists. And I think the fact that in the end the polls didn't really reflect the result of the election goes a lot with that, because a lot of those voters were hesitating. And I think there the coalition with the far right really played a role, because a lot of those people might be liberal when it comes to the economic policies, but they are social when it comes to fundamental rights, and they didn't go to vote for the Popular Party.
This is the big gap that exists in Spanish politics now. There's no Liberal Party. Ciudadanos made huge mistakes by trying to take over the right, and it was a gamble, and it failed. As a result, they alienated the other half of their support. So now that's why in the regional elections they ended up with very, very small totals of the vote, 1 or 2% in some cases.
And it's also governed, I think this goes back to what you said, it's demonizing Vox, while at the same time we have independent parties, nationalist parties from the north and from Catalonia who also lost their votes comparing to the 2019. For example, Esquerra, they lost around 7 votes, and also Junts, they lost 1 seat, meaning that in the end, those are actually the parties who are now claiming something from might be a future government that will most probably not happen, which is amnesty also for some of the prisoners, which is also indulgence for Puigdemont, referendum.
You mentioned, well, just on that note of Carles Puigdemont, we asked our correspondent in Barcelona, Cristina Giner, to tell us what was being spoken about in the newspapers this week. Take a look.
Neither of the main parties in Spain have achieved the majority to form government. Now all eyes are on Carles Puigdemont party, the Independence Party, then it's become the kingmaker to form government. So many newspapers underline the fact that Carles Puigdemont, sitting in Brussels and pending a detention order from the Spanish justice, is going to be key to form the government. So I think you might be seeing Carles Puigdemont in Brussels putting pressure for the negotiations with Pedro Sánchez.
Cristina Giner reporting for us there from Barcelona. So how will this play out? I mean, Pedro Sánchez has nothing in common with Carles Puigdemont. But let's just hear from Garvin first.
It's also nothing really that Sánchez can actually give him, because a referendum is probably not legal. Perhaps one could be agreed with the central government, but then it wouldn't have any effect, because to have any constitutional effect, you need a majority in both houses. You need 2/3 majority in the Congress and in the Senate. That's not going to happen because the PP won't give it to them.
Beatrix, your take.
Yeah, so I think what is interesting, when we have this conversation, we often only talk about what it comes to the pro-independence political parties as such, but we don't talk about their politics. And the reality is that when it comes to some of them, they are left-leaning. So that means that they don't only have in common with this. I mean, they're not only asking for things on the general of the national government in terms of the independence, but they're also leaning towards them because they defend the same policies and they do. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Then when it comes to what they ask, I agree, it's very unlikely that they're going to get a referendum because it's just unconstitutional. So they might just go for getting some advantages in terms of competences and so on. And the reality is that, as you said, indeed, they have lost votes, but also because the politics of the national government have been less confrontational than the previous government. And that actually went into against them because they couldn't use that tension towards the national government, and that
they're just trying to win time.
But yeah, this is correct that Junts and Esquerra, they are leaning towards the left. But if you look into their programs, they're obviously having one thing in mind, and this is Catalonia, and this is not Spain, and these are the Spanish general elections. They also want, for example, a decentralization of what is interesting for Europe, of the Next Generation EU funds, and so on. They also want Rodalias. And there are also several things that during the campaign where Sanchez was telling lies during the campaign, and now there is also this price that he needs to pay. And also, let's just remind that Carles Puigdemont is actually the guy who is behind the illegal referendum in 2017, and who flawed the country in a trunk. And now he wants to. He also has this personal thing that he's most probably scared of incarceration, and this is something that he's again following his personal agenda.
And can Junts, of course, afford another election? That is the question, because they came in fourth there in Catalonia. But I want to just zoom out of Spanish politics and just take a look at Spain from where we're sitting here. We're in Brussels, the capital, de facto capital of the European Union. Spain is presiding over this union at the moment. What impact will this political vacuum have on the project, on the plans for the EU and the policies?
It would have a significant impact. Before the election, when I was talking to diplomats and EU officials, there was a lot of concern about a political shift, because they were worried about Vox getting into government, because that would have a significant impact, especially on climate change policies, but also on fundamental rights that have been pushed for the past few years, because Spain has been leading in progressive politics. But there was also a lot of concern about what we see now, a blockage of the parliament and a weak government that it's not able to put the political impetus that we need in the presidency to move forward a number of policies, considering that this is going to be the last effective presidency before the election?
I mean, I think this worries about Vox getting into government at a European level were overblown, because they were at best going to be a junior coalition partner for them. They weren't going to be able to exercise influence over everything. They had to govern with a Partido Popular that needs to make sure it maintains its support in other areas. So I think this was a case of people overdoing the influence of the far right in Europe.
And who was overblowing?
A lot of non-Spaniards were overblowing the influence of Vox in Spain in the way they're thinking, oh, could this be like Italy? It's not like Italy, where Giorgia Meloni's the dominant party on the right. It would be like Italy in the early 1990s, where, yes, they'd have some influence, but they wouldn't have been able to change the direction of the government.
And turnout, of course, was notable as well in those elections last weekend, 70%, I believe.
Yes,
7 in 10.
Indeed. And also what is very important also to say here is that with this blockage that Beatriz also mentioned, it will be impossible to move forward on any level. And also the economic deadlock, also inflation that is there is
well, indeed,
not
Spain
a bright
is
future.
Fourth largest economy. I mean, it has massive debt. It has lots to do. The business community I saw this week were extremely concerned about the credibility of the country. I mean, this is also a problem.
Well, what's interesting is that on the one hand, we had new data from the IMF, and Spain still is one of the leading countries in terms of growth. And we also had concerns expressed by the IMF at the same time, saying a political deadlock is definitely not good for economy. So I think that is a factor that is going to play out in the next few months. And what everybody was hoping for was indeed that there was a strong government in September that could lead the way, take over the country, and make sure that moving forward there is a stable government. And that's not going to be the case.
And what was the mood on the ground? Like, what were people saying to you when you were talking to them?
Well, the interesting thing, and this is something that we haven't talked about, but I think it's interesting, is that when it comes to the policies of this government, a lot of people really are pro those policies. They really like them. But then when it comes to the personas, when it comes to Sanchez, there is a lot of animosity towards him. And that has been what the far right and the right has been using, creating this image of him being an evil character that only cares about grabbing power. So what a lot of people were saying, it was not necessarily that they were against this government, but very much that they didn't like him and they didn't like him as a person.
But actually here in Brussels, Pedro Sanchez had a lot of credibility. He was charismatic. He was liked. He spoke fluent English. I mean, he was perceived well here on the European stage.
Well, but in the end, it's Spaniards who vote, and as we are seeing now in Spain, the uncertainty and instability that is growing, we'll only see. But also, it's also important to say that there are still some incoming votes that are to be counted of the Spanish nationals living abroad permanently and temporarily. They are going to be counted in the next few days. There's still Pepe. I'm an optimist, so Pepe still might win additional one seat, either in Madrid, Cantabria, or Catalan city of Girona, which is also the birth city of Puigdemont. So we'll see. Maybe the key of the new government with the socialists might not be here in Waterloo at Puigdemont's hands.
And what about Feijóo? I mean, he's not so well known, is he, on the European stage? Is he? Is he liked?
I mean, he's not really well known. He governed well in Galicia. He governed as a moderate. He's having difficulty dealing with currents in the Partido Popular who want him to be much more hardline, and I don't think his heart's really in that, which is one of the reasons why it didn't come off very well when he tried. He should have been able to impose a moderate campaign on his campaign team and on his party. If he'd done that, I think we might well be looking at something close to a PP absolute majority. He should have told people to postpone their deals with Vox for 4 weeks. I mean, Sanchez is very Machiavellian, and Feijóo just isn't Machiavellian enough.
He isn't Machiavellian enough, Beatriz?
I think it's interesting what you mentioned, because indeed one of the confrontations between Feijóo and Vox was that he's a regionalist. He was a president of Galicia, which is also a very nationalistic region. So it was interesting how he was very uncomfortable with that position where he had to align with a political party that goes against everything he believes in. So indeed, I think that was very problematic. And this is why he's also being confronted with division within his own political party. It's already asking for his head behind the scenes. So that's interesting. Going back to the question of Sanchez being perceived as an influential leader in Europe, I think that's important as well, because I think a lot of the Spaniards were hoping for this presidency to be a moment where Spain would regain
a moment for
strength.
Spain to shine, because of course that's what EU presidency are also about, and there'll be a trip to Granada. There'll be a summit taking place a little bit later this year. But for now, that is, I'm afraid, all we have time for. Thank you so much for your insights, and you don't go anywhere. Stay with us, because after the break we'll be hearing how this month's erratic weather forecast is impacting Europe's treasured tourism sector. Stay with us here on Euronews. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly talk show about European news. I'm Maeve McMahon. Now, it's peak holiday season here in Europe, and Greenpeace has issued their very own weather forecast, saying that some world records should not be broken. With dangerous storms to wildfires, this summer's trip can easily turn into a holiday from hell, and also a living nightmare for locals. Multiple flights have already been cancelled, and red weather alerts have been issued in 23 Italian cities, with newspaper headlines warning that the south is burning. Now, we're watching this, of course, from Brussels. How do you feel the EU response has been so far? Has it been adequate?
Well, I think it's a very complex issue, because this is not the result of short-term policies. This is long-term policies. We're talking about climate change and the significant impact that it's having in terms of heat, but also in terms of wildfires and how difficult it is to control them. So I think it's hard to put the finger only on the EU, even though I think definitely we need more ambitious climate policy so that we can fight against the reasons why we're confronted with this. Now, in terms of what the EU can do right now...
On the EU, I mean, they do have their hub. They have their civil, their emergency response.
As I was going to say, what the EU can do is actually pulling resources from different countries to help to fight those wildfires, but there is little that they can do in terms of like...
Well, they're definitely monitoring the situation. So we went down to have a look and have a chat with them. We spoke to the Emergency Response Coordination Centre. Take a look.
In case, like in Greece, of big forest fires, we have planes that are spread all over Europe and are ready to react any time. Compared to the past, this year continues the trend from last year of higher temperatures, lower humidity and strong winds, which leads, of course, to a higher fire danger index, which we can expect actually more forest fires during the summer.
That was Peter Bonev there. And we also heard this week from the Greek Prime Minister saying that the Mediterranean was a climate change hotspot, a bit like what you said, Beatrix, and that there was actually no magical defence mechanism. I mean, is Europe ready for what's to come?
So last year, the Commissioner for Emergencies, he proposed, and this is something that it hasn't been put on the table formally, but he proposed to have an EU force that could respond to these kind of cases. And I think this is interesting because it's becoming more of an issue and they need to have better coordination in that sense.
I mean, 5 years ago, this was not even on the cards here at the EU. They didn't need to deal with this.
I mean, it's important to have an emergency response, but it's also important to have longer-term fire management policies. You have to have a lot of interventions to make sure that underbrush doesn't grow. You have to create fire breaks. You have to train people to act locally. There are a lot of prevention measures that can be taken. The question is whether those prevention measures are being taken, whether there's enough effort being put into skilling people to build that kind of long-term fire defence, because these things are just going to get worse.
And in your home country, in Croatia, I believe the situation is pretty worrying as well.
Right, it's not only that we are having heat waves, but as you can also expect, because of the climate change, this is also an issue that must be debated, because a lot of people now are seeing there are also floods, there are storms coming in with winds blowing 100 kilometers per hour, and obviously there will always be some people saying, well, this is obviously, we are not having heat, we're having something else, but this is also, again, a proof of climate change. And we just also had a construction worker who was killed due to one of those storms. And also, as we can see, tourism is suffering a lot. Yeah. There are also several camps that, due to those storms, saw themselves reflected. Several emergencies came up. So this is a very concerning situation. Also for tourism, as Croatia is one of the countries that has highest reliance on of its GDP on tourism,
Croatia,
like 25% almost.
Yeah,
Croatia.
I mean, it's a huge industry.
Montenegro, 30%.
Yeah, for Europe. And that's actually a point that we raised with our Rome correspondent, Giorgia Orlandi, who sent us this update from the capital of Italy.
Well, although the Italian government has pledged to make tourism more sustainable, experts say that there has already been a shift in preferences towards cooler and more northern destinations. And it's not yet clear how such change is going to impact the country's economy. If you take Rome, for example, Italy's capital, well, several tourists have collapsed due to extreme temperatures in the past few days.
Georgia Orlandi there reporting from a very hot Italy where some people said it was like walking around in a sauna or having a hairdryer blown in your face. I mean, how will countries like this adapt what they can offer to tourists?
That is an excellent question. I think it's part of the policies that we're going to see moving forward because, as you said, the temperatures are so high that people are reconsidering their holidays, deciding to move into colder places at some other point, maybe coming to Europe earlier in the year because it's impossible to come during summer. But it's important to make a reflection on what this means for European economies, especially Southern European economies, because we need transformation. We can't rely anymore on tourism. We saw that during the pandemic, and we see even more now this summer.
And Garvin Walsh, is the EU here taking this seriously?
I mean, you're seeing Northern Europeans starting to behave a bit more like Southern Europeans who don't go to the sun in August because they know it's too hot. They're going to have to change their plans. The era of mass tourism, for the sun in August is probably coming to an end because it's getting too hot for that. Same thing is going to happen in North Africa and Turkey as well. And what the EU needs to really think about is how it can support the economies of these areas in different ways. What are the new technologies? What are the new sources of wealth that will enable these communities to survive and prosper?
And we've seen over in Germany doctors calling for siestas to be introduced because for people to cope with this heat because it'll be dramatically changing in the next couple of years. What do you feel the EU can do to support countries like your own?
Well, obviously there are solutions that need to be brought in as short-term solutions, more EU unity cooperation that we also saw last year, and it's also funny to see that we're talking about record temperatures, record heat this year. We also talked about it last year, and most probably next year temperatures will rise again. But also long-term initiatives are very important, also informing citizens, informing tourists. I mean, this is also very easy to say from our perspective here from Brussels, when we know almost whole Brussels in summer is empty because we all have vacations in August. This is also maybe something to consider in the private sector, but also in the public sector to change the whole spectrum.
That would mean changing the school.
Changing the school as well. I mean, obviously, we know in Austria, for example, in the 70s, there were introduced the so-called energy vacations in February that are still maintained up to date to save energy. So maybe just to adjust a little bit our systems on one hand, and obviously long-term solutions that we all know, because as we know, tourism is also important. 5% of the whole gas climate emissions are due to the tourism.
And according to the European Central Bank, climate change could actually wipe out 4% of Europe's GDP by 2030. That's, of course, in a worst-case scenario, Beatrix Rios, but it's something I believe that you'll be reporting on more and more in the next few years.
For sure. I mean, we are seeing that the consequences of climate change have become one of the main issues that we are discussing. Now we're talking about tourism, but over the past few months, we have been talking a lot about agriculture due to droughts, but also to massive flooding. So that's incredibly difficult for farmers to deal with, and it's going to be at the core of the discussion, I think, on the EU as well. We have seen even a shift into the money within the Common Agricultural Policy to trying to support those farmers. So I think all depends on climate change.
I'm going to have to stop you there, Beatrix Rios. Thank you so much, and thank you as well to you for your insights, and thank you for watching. Stay with us here, though, on Euronews, and of course check out euronews.com. Hello there, you're watching Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly talk show. I'm Maeve McMahon, and along with my panel, we're sifting through the news of the week. And one story that took our fancy was this: The Economist's chart on the best places in the world to live. And Europe is, once again, on top. Vienna, the capital of Austria, has been number one for the past 8 out of 10 surveys, followed by Copenhagen and then Melbourne. Ratings are based on 30 factors from stability to healthcare, culture to the environment, education to infrastructure. So what do you think of this list? What makes Vienna so unique, Sandra?
Well, I myself, funny enough, lived in Vienna and studied there for 8 years. So there are really plenty of reasons why Vienna is a most livable city. And also, funny enough, at the same moment, Vienna is the worst city for expats to live in. And also maybe the reason why I'm here now in Brussels.
And will you stick around Brussels?
We'll see.
We'll see. Garvin, quick reaction?
I mean, there are very few European capital cities I wouldn't live in, but Vienna is one of them. I find it incredibly stuffy, boring, lacking counterculture, and clearly the people who composed these index aren't interested in having an interesting life. They're not interested in even buying food on a Sunday, because even the convenience stores close at 6 o'clock.
Anyone from Vienna, do write in a comment there to that. But we want to also hear what people here in Brussels feel a livable city should actually really look like. So our Ellie Liberté was out on the streets finding out.
A place where I can ride a bicycle without being harassed by angry people in cars, a place where there's good public transportation that's paid for by our taxes, and where people are at least nice enough to be relatively friendly. They don't have to be too friendly.
I think it's really nice to have like a clean city. It puts like a nice character to all of to enjoy the city.
General prices for food and stuff, and being able to get everywhere. Like the public transport's really important to being able to get where you need to go in the city.
Good pubs.
I think somewhere that can be both really busy but also has its quieter moments, so it's not too intense all the time.
So busy but quiet, green spaces, good public transport, the main points people are stressing there. Beatrix, what makes a livable city in your eyes?
In my eyes, indeed, public transport, the fact that you can bike everywhere without getting into trouble, that you also have a city that is adapted to climate change, because we were talking about that before, so there is more green spaces, it's more livable for citizens and not for cars, and a city where you can feel integrated no matter your social and economic background. I think that's important.
And will we ever see Brussels on that list?
If they can finally sort out rubbish collection, I think it's in a pretty good state. People are very nice to cyclists. They're it's walkable. Public transport is reasonable, but they really have to sort out rubbish collection.
Well, on waste collection, I was looking at a study by the European Parliament, and seemingly in Denmark and also in Vienna, it's excellent. It's exquisite.
But I think also that something we didn't talk about Vienna and Copenhagen is also the social housing system, which is very good, and the access to housing is amazing, and I think that really makes a difference.
That is a major issue, isn't it?
Brussels is also a very poor city. You have to take that into account, that a lot of the wealthy left in the 70s to live in Flanders, and as a result, although it's the capital, and although its economic growth figures and the GDP figures are very high, the actual income of people living in Brussels is surprisingly low.
Yeah, and I mean, even though the taxes here are extremely high in Belgium, right?
Unfortunately.
What about you? What would be the city that you would love to live in?
Oh, that's a very good question. I actually wanted to live in Vienna at some point, because personally, when I went there to visit a friend, I really enjoyed my time there. But I'd like to live somewhere else outside Europe at some point.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid that is all we have time for this edition of Brussels, My Love. Thank you so much to our guests, to Beatrix, to Sandra, and also to Garvin Wolf for being with us here as always. Your insights are brilliant. And thank you so much to you for tuning in. If you want to reach out to us, if you have any comments or any requests for topics, of course, that you would like us to look into here at Euronews, please send us an email. Our email address is brusselsmylove@euronews.com. You can also catch us on social media. We're on Twitter, or X as it's called now, and we're also on Instagram. Take care, and we'll see you soon here on Euronews and also on euronews.com.